The Viom experiments in Sweden were a series of human experiments where patients of Viom Hospital for Intellectually Disabled in Lund, Sweden, were fed a large amount of sweets to provoke dental caries. Between 1945 and 1955, the experiments were sponsored both by the sugar industry and the dental community, in an effort to determine whether carbohydrates affected the formation of cavities. The experiment provided extensive knowledge about dental health and resulted in enough empirical data to link the intake of sugar to dental caries. However, today they're considered to have violated the principles of medical ethics. During the 20th century, scientists from Porton Down conducted experiments on British and Indian soldiers to test the effects of mustard gas. From 1916 until 1989, more than 20,000 British servicemen were subjected to chemical warfare trials. The experiments on Indian servicemen were conducted in Rawalpindi, British India, during 1930s and 1940s. It is unclear whether the Indian trial subjects, some of whom were hospitalized by their injuries, were all volunteers. In Nazi Germany, the law for prevention of genetically defective progeny, passed on 14 July 1933, legalized the involuntary sterilization of people with weak-mindedness, schizophrenia, alcohol abuse, insanity, blindness, deafness, and physical deformities. The purpose of these experiments was to develop a method of sterilization which would be suitable for sterilizing millions of people with a minimum of time and effort. The radiation treatment became the favored choice of sterilization. Specific amounts of exposure to radiation destroyed a person's ability to produce sperm or ova. Prisoners were brought to a room and asked to complete forums, which took 2 to 3 minutes. In this time, the radiation treatment was administered, and unknown to the prisoners, they were rendered completely sterile. Imperial Japan experimented on prisoners by conducting vivisections, dismemberments, and bacterial inoculations. It induced epidemics on a very large scale from 1932 onward through the Second Sino-Japanese War. After the war, Supreme Commander of Occupation, Douglas MacArthur, gave immunity in the name of the United States to Shiroishi and all its members, in exchange for all the results of their experiments. In November 2006, Dr. Akira Makino confessed that he had performed surgery and amputations on condemned prisoners, including women and children. In the 1920s and 1930s, Aboriginal Australians were subject to medical experiments on how they experienced pain and where blood samples were forcibly taken. The experiments were motivated by a system of scientific racism and were carried out by researchers from the University of Adelaide. In 2002, the Vice-Chancellor of the university described the experiments as degrading and in some cases barbarous, and the school issued a formal apology to the Aboriginals. Project MKUltra was an illegal human experiments program designed and undertaken by the CIA to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations, to weaken people and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental states and brain functions. Without the subject's consent, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other forms of torture were committed. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. scientific researchers in Guatemala infected hundreds of mental patients with STD. Researchers from the PHS conducted experiments on approximately 1,500 male and female patients housed at Guatemala's National Mental Health Hospital. The scientists injected the patients with gonorrhea and syphilis and encouraged many of them to pass the disease on to others. The experiments were done in cooperation with the Guatemalan government. The PHS carried out these experiments under the guise of a syphilis inoculation. The Tuskegee syphilis study was a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the PHS and CDC on a group of nearly 400 African American men with syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated. Due to medical advancements, the disease was completely treatable, but the men were not informed of the nature of the experiment, and more than 100 died as a result. The Poison Laboratory of the Soviet Secret Services was a research and development facility of the Soviet secret police agencies. Here, they tested a variety of lethal poisons on prisoners from the gulags. The objective of these experiments was to identify a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected post-mortem. Test potions were administered to the victims along with a meal or a drink, disguised as medication, culminating in a death within 15 minutes. An experiment allegedly carried out by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II saw young infants raised without human interaction in order to determine if there was a natural language which might demonstrate once their voices matured. It is claimed that he was trying to discover what language Adam and Eve would have spoken. Foster mothers could in no way speak with them, for he would have learnt her language. However, Frederick was unsuccessful, for the children could not live without the clapping of their hands and gestures.